Welcome to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond and I'm joined by Alex Brown, and this lesson is about essays. It's actually the third installment in a series of essay-related lessons, and it's our first that we're going to touch on popular questions. So, Alex, what's the most popular question that you might encounter in essay land here?
Yeah, almost without exception, it's going to be about your career goals. So it'll come in a variety of different forms, but you're going to essentially need to address these questions. So why MBA? Why now? Why my school? What's the short-term goal? What's the long-term goal? So those are the different components of the question that you'll want to tackle. Obviously, schools approach this question in their own nuanced fashion. So as we talked about in a prior lesson, make sure you absolutely read the question and answer the specifics of their particular question. But those are going to be the elements to address. Why MBA? Why now? Why my school? What's the short-term goal? What's the long-term goal?
And what's challenging about it is I feel like no school asks for it exactly the same way. Some schools won't ask why our school. Some schools won't ask about, the long-term goal, or they only want the short-term, So there's this temptation, as you mentioned in another lesson we did, to just, you write one kind of goals essay and you just throw it in, but you really do need to tailor it. Yeah. But it is a common
But I would argue, Graham, not to step in, but let's say, for example, the school doesn't ask why my school, but you're trying to make the case for your goals and why the MBA and so on and so forth. If you don't address why that particular school, you're missing an opportunity to show your fit and why that school makes sense. So even in the case where it might not be explicitly asked, it might still be relevant to the other questions that are being asked. Another example of that might be that a school might only ask for your short-term goal. But to make that short-term goal contextualized, you might want to introduce what the long-term goal is that justifies why you're pursuing the short-term goal. So yeah, I completely agree. Some schools will ask it quite differently, but all these issues are very related.
Yeah, and I guess we don't want to put words in the mouths of our, people who are applying to school because they have to write the essays on their own. But what are some of the reasons that people would often give for, like, why now, or why an MBA in the first place? What are some of the things that people should be thinking about as they formulate that stuff?
I mean, hopefully they don't have to think too hard about that. Otherwise, right. Why are you dropping 200 grand on and giving up a career for 2 years, right? So the opportunity cost and the investment that you're putting in would suggest to me that you've already thought long and hard about this stuff. So this shouldn't be stuff you're actually having to think for the first time as you're going through the admissions process. You've actually thought about this for several months, maybe even years. Maybe it's been part of your plan since undergrad to go work a specific experience or to get the MBA to then continue on a trajectory that you've had mapped out for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So when you think about things like the why now, typically what folks, on average, maybe it's 4 to 5 years of work experience at this point. So if you hit that marker, maybe there's less emphasis on why you need to address why now. But if you're coming at it after 1 or 2 years of work experience, maybe you need to put more emphasis on justifying why now is the right time. Much like if you were 8 or 10 years and sort of at the other end of the spectrum, it becomes a more relevant concern in terms of the why now.
Yeah, and I would echo that and also add that with like why MBA, for instance, I think demonstrating that you've identified some gaps in your knowledge set that have maybe come to light via the work that you've done, experiences you've had in the office where you knew that, oh, wow, I wish I knew more about, corporate finance so that I could have plugged in on that project. So knowing where those gaps are and being able to point to the coursework and the relevant experiences in business school that are going to help fill those gaps and move you along in your career, I think that's a natural thing that people speak to as well. When we talk about short and long-term goals, again, we stressed this when we did a lesson specifically on career goals, but in these essays where they're asking about your goals, they're looking for a short-term goal often, which would mean a kind of industry and a function. What about naming companies that you would work for? Is that needed?
I think in the short term, it's valid to do that. for some schools, they might even actually ask you that, and that might even be in the data form. So this what we're talking about now is as relevant if this question is being asked in the data forms as it is if it's being asked in the essays portion of the candidacy. But it might well be relevant to do that. But I would say don't try to sort of shoehorn in the name of a company just to try to convince the AdCom you've done such a high level of research, you know exactly which company. If it naturally comes into play that there's a certain company that you admire, that you would truly want to work for, and you see a pathway for that coming out of your MBA directly, and so forth, then I think it's absolutely fair game. Not maybe in the long run, but that short-term goal coming out of school.
Yeah, and I think the long run can absolutely be a bit more broad brushstrokes. Yes. I'd love to be working in the C-suite or as a CMO or whatever role you're thinking of in a certain industry, but you don't need to say, it would be almost a little weird to say my long-term goal is I'm going to be the CMO of company X. That would be a bit too specific. Yeah. Going back to the short term though, I do think that I don't mind seeing some potential targets, but one thing I don't like to see is if all the targets are just like if someone says, "Oh, I want to do consulting and I want to work at Bain, BCG, or McKinsey," I start to think, okay, well, how much research do they really put into that? They've just named the top 3 consulting firms, but have they? I'd almost rather see someone say, "Wow, I'm really interested in consulting and in healthcare." And so as a result, I'm focusing on working for a strategy consultancy that has a strong reputation and does a lot of work in that domain. And firms that I'm considering are McKinsey, Deloitte, and Carney. And it could be because those 3 happen to have that kind of a focus. So that is better for me than just seeing someone throw out the top 3 in any industry, because that's kind of... So in any event, these goals are important, and understanding why you need the MBA, why now's the right time, all this stuff, and even why a given school critical, and obviously one of the most popular essay questions that you'll encounter. So you're going to have to write about this at some point. So the last bit here around goals is something around alternate goals. And there are actually a couple of schools that say, what do you want to do? And what would you do if you can't do that? Yeah. So how do I handle that? How radically different should that backup plan be? And how important is it to have that kind of a plan B?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, a couple of schools will ask this specifically. So for those schools, you need to address it. For schools that don't ask you for it explicitly, don't address it. Go all in on your plan. Yeah. Because we often get asked, well, I'm debating between A and B on my career plans, as part of my application process. We see this a lot on ApplyWire. So I'm like, pick A or pick B and make that your story and go all in on it. That's going to serve you best in the application process. But for those schools that do ask you for the plan B, then just make sure that, well, in terms of my perspective, plan A and plan B are short-term alternatives to get to the same long-term aspiration. That should be the connection between the two.
Yeah, I could not agree more. So if a school doesn't ask, just go with the single plan. And if they do, I think the two need to be, as you say, on the same pathway to the long term. I would really shudder to see an essay where someone's like, I want to do consulting, and if that doesn't work out, I'll try my hand at investment banking. Yeah. Something that's just so different in terms of the background you need. And so definitely stick to a plan, whether or not there might be multiple, paths to that plan. That's fine. Yeah. But stick to that. So we're going to keep talking about essays, and our next lesson in the Academy is going to be, again, about some popular questions that you see across MBA applications.